Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you. If you've been here before, welcome back. If you have not been here before, welcome to the People's Forum. We are a political and popular education space dedicated to uniting working class movements abroad and here in New York. And so, welcome to tonight's book talk. This is a discussion on The Great Recoil by Paolo Gerbaudo, a sociologist and political theorist at and I apologize for my pronunciation, but the Scuola Normale Superiore in Italy and King's College London. Um, Paolo will be in conversation with Carlo Invernizzi-Accetti, who is an associate professor of political science at CUNY and a visiting professor of European politics at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He's also the author of Technopopulism, A New Logic of Democratic Politics. Also here with us is Kate Aronoff, who's a staff writer at the New Republic covering climate and energy, and the author of Overheated, How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back. So welcome to our space. We will have copies of The Great Recoil available for purchase through our bookstore, 1804 Books. I encourage you to check it out. And we have snacks and drinks at our cafe. And with that, I will pass it off to the speakers.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for being here. Yeah, so the purpose of today's conversation is really actually having quite an informal conversation and to look at some of the topics that are discussed in the book, to see what they can tell us about what is happening to politics and where we are going with these strange times we are living through and what we may expect for the future, and also what we may expect in terms of strategy. Because I think really the spirit of the book is how we can develop a left strategy for our times, for these very strange times. Times that are strange because many things that looked impossible, say 5 years ago, are now here with us, right? Things that look impossible, such as the pandemic, right? I mean, now it's already in a way fading away from view, especially in Europe, where mask mandates are are ending. Like for example, in Britain, where I'm coming from, there's almost no mask mandates. Things like, I mean, obviously climate change. The awareness of that was already there with us, and as a person who's been involved in climate movements, already say in the noughties in the UK, there was already a perception of that. But somehow, because of the demonstration effect of the pandemic, I think that psychologically was quite interesting. There's now a much stronger sense that, hey, this is not just a threat sometime in the future, a threat that, as people who were trying to minimize it would say, yes, our children or our nieces and nephews would face it, but something that people are aware that is very much here with us. Today, I look at this interesting poll. It was by the Pew Research Center, and it said that 73% of US citizens say that they think that we'll be affected by climate change in their lifetime. So there's been a very significant change in public perceptions also at that level. Namely, not just, it's not anymore a question of whether it exists or it doesn't exist, that has already basically gone through public consciousness. Now it's a matter of when will it affect me in my lifetime. Yeah? Other things that we thought were not possible is a major economic crisis dragging on for years and years with no apparent exit, right? I mean, obviously that has been already with us since 2008, but already the time was presented as by many people as a sort of exceptional, abnormal circumstance. We will go back to normal, like the discussion of like return to normality again and again. And especially in Europe instead, what we got was a lost decade of stagnation, of austerity, where there is no clear solution in sight, where there is no return to normality. And then now the final trauma, the final breaking of our certainties is obviously the war, right? The Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I think has been a major shock and is now proving a major source of anxiety for many people because it did away with many things people took for granted, right? Especially took for granted here. In general, the book is written, say, looking at Europe and the US in particular, namely that, yeah, war still existed, but in places that were not close by, right? That there was a third world war would be something like only mad conspiracy theorists would think about, was something completely out of the realm of possibility, and that whatever, we were in a sort of civilized phase of like human civilization where yes, you may have some peripheral conflicts here and there, but no major kind of systemic conflict and no risk of escalation. So this is to say, this is a bit the kind of grim and dismal kind of landscape we are living through. And this is the starting point to understand the kind of politics we are experiencing. When I started writing the book and I signed the contract for the book in 2017, it was very much meant to be a book on populism. Then, in a way, the book evolved with the time and was delayed for quite some time. And when I was writing the book at the start, there was all this debate on what is populism, right? Because one of, I say, a fourth trauma or a fourth reason for uncertainty was indeed the rise of all these strange political phenomena, both on the left and the right, but most prominently on the right, which again were very much in contradiction with people's expectation. People's expectation that ultimately politics would be a rather, how would you say, unheated confrontation where people, as Zizek famously put it, would be about Pepsi or Coca-Cola, right? It would be basically, do you want the market with a little bit of compassion, or do you want the market with some sadism going with it, right? It was more of a matter of sides, right? So you always had your steak, and then you could choose either potatoes or Brussels sprouts, right? But it was not really a kind of fundamental fundamental difference in the main thing that the politics had on offer. And then you had the rise of all these movements, right, that were kind of described as populism, again, like most notably, obviously, for the US, Trump, in Italy, the country I'm from, Salvini, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Le Pen in France, that, as we know, we were discussing that before, as we were mingling, was now actually very close to perhaps winning the elections. There was recently the first poll ever that gave her as winning in the runoff. So we shall see what happens with that. And then there was parallelly on the left, all this rise of movements, sometimes described as left populism, namely Podemos in Spain, a new party in 2014, rising on the back of the Indignados, which in turn was also described as a populist social movement because it made reference to ordinary people, common people, the small man. You had Corbyn in Britain, something completely unexpected, right? It came as a complete shock, I think, even to himself. He would have never thought, actually, he entered the contest thinking he'd never win, right? Would be more of a sort of performative thing to show that you could bring new ideas to the debate, but never with a kind of idea of actually winning that contest. And obviously Bernie Sanders here in the US, on the back of another movement, was very much a kind of people's movement, Occupy Wall Street, the Gilets jaunes in France in 2018, 2019, and a very interesting movement that really mobilized the periphery, right? The second France, the peripheral France that we very rarely hear about. And while Occupy Wall Street occupied Zuccotti Park and occupied squares, and the Indignados occupied main squares in the cities of Spain, interestingly, the Gilets jaunes movement occupied roundabouts, like malls places in suburban areas where actually the contemporary working class tends to live, which are the places also of places of production, logistics, and so on and so forth. So this to say, basically, in a way, initially the attempt was to say, what is this? And what is this going beyond the fact that it is about the people versus the elite, right? Which was basically the almost automatic explanation of that. And also which provided an explanation as to why you would find it on the left and on the right, right? So it was often explained by theorists as basically this is a shared rhetoric, which doesn't have really much substance to it, which can be inflected, articulated in very radically different ways. Yet, as I was analyzing these movements, I was kind of slowly realizing there was something more to that it was not just something about form in a way, about rhetoric, about ethos, about anti-elitism, right? So there was an important component. I slowly kind of came to realize that there was something about the state. Something about the state in the way in which lot of the actual content of the discourse alluded to a sense of political disorder, to a sense of anxiety, to a sense of lack of control, to a sense of agoraphobia, as fear of open spaces, as fear of exposure, fragility, vulnerability, which in turn almost carried as implicit demand the demand for state intervention. And that was clear, perhaps most evidently on the right, which I think what I got to learn analyzing these tends to be more ideologically flexible and therefore more able to capture the spirit of the times than the left often is. So on the right, that came as a demand for sovereignty, right? Which is one of the three terms that I discuss in the book as the kind of emerging signifiers of our era: sovereignty, protection, and control. Sovereignty as a term that was famously appealed to in the context of the Brexit campaign, this sense of we want to take back control of our borders, our fisheries, our money, our laws. It was also seen in demands, obviously, for border controls against migration, in a certain protectionist turn that I think was also quite shocking for people, in the sense that there was this long-standing assumption that we were in an era of free markets and that globalization was good, while Trump, in the presidency, famously launched a trade war with China in 2018. And at the opposite end of the political spectrum, you could see similar statist, though very divergent statist claims being made on the left. A recuperation of Keynesianism, we need more demand, we need more state spending, we need more investments, a demand for social protection, for social security, which actually has been a very long-standing tradition of the left, fighting for social security. In the elections of 1945 in Britain, one of the most famous labor posters was social security with the face of a worker, right? Social security in terms of social provisions, healthcare, welfare, and so on and so forth. Or the Social Democrats in Sweden had this famous slogan saying, secure people thrive. Right? Namely that only if people have security, they can actually be ambitious, they can can thrive in their life, they can thrive in their relationships and in their work. Yeah? So basically, in that process, because I mean, writing books is very much a process of discovery at the best of times, and I came to realize that there was this thing about the state, and in a way, when the pandemic struck, some of this, that's a very good sound for a status claim. And so obviously, when the pandemic, in a way, I was already I almost completed the book in 2019. It was just a matter of kind of like refining that. When the pandemic struck, in a way, many of the hypotheses of the book were, in a way, tragically confirmed. Can you hear me? So obviously, right, the state, people, things people were not used to at all. So the state telling you you need to stay at home, you cannot go out, mandates, right? Mask mandates, lockdown mandates, vaccine mandates, and then obviously creating a lot of angry responses, generating all these anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-lockdown movements. But a striking thing as well was that a very large majority of people saying, all right, I'll do that because of necessity. Basically, the state is asking me this, but it's not asking me this because of whatever authoritarianism, totalitarianism, because there is a matter of necessity and I need to stay at home. Yeah. Which very much went against the grain of neoliberalism, right? And all the imaginary of neoliberalism, the idea that basically people that become egotistical, possessive individuals that wouldn't do anything for other people but themselves, while the behavior of people, the discipline, the large majority of people demonstrated, instead showed that that wasn't the case. And with this slogan, protect yourself and others, very much encapsulating this sense of society is facing dangers and we need to protect ourselves. Society has to be defended, to quote Foucault. Society has to be protected. So in a way, to me, this realization explains a lot of what politics is about these days. That this is the main hypothesis of the book. In a way, we are not anymore in the era of high neoliberalism, in a era in which neoliberalism is dominant. Neoliberalism has been one of many fashions of capitalism. It was not the first, it won't be the last. Neoliberalism as an ideology, as an idea of the free market, the unregulated market, and the minimum state, explain many things about the era we were brought up in. But it doesn't explain many things about how society is now and about how capitalism is now. And these are things that don't affect only the political extremes, so to speak, the left and the right, nor the pandemic situation. These are things that we are increasingly seeing in the political mainstream, where a lot of what political debate is about, what the mobilization of consensus is about the question, who will protect me and in which ways? And where, while political discourse before was revolve around the question, what should we expect from the market? Now revolves around a different question. What should the state do for us? And there are very different answers to that question. So as I articulate in the book, the protectionism that you see on the right tends to protect two things: home and homeland. People's property and rich people's property from redistributive demands, and the national territory from a number of enemies represented by migrants, represented by other nations, foreign powers, and so on and so forth. The protectivism you see on the left, maybe the kind of the progressive version of the politics of protection, is instead about protecting people's conditions of life that have been severely eroded under neoliberalism by setting new minimum standards that basically establish what is the minimum conditions, humane conditions for people to live in, like minimum wage, minimum public services, right? A new platform of minimums, protecting people from the environment, protecting the environment, say, from people as well, establishing support mechanism in society and protecting the human habitat, right? Which is a discourse that is quite different from what it was the case before, which was like, let's protect the polar bears or let's protect the pandas. No, Now it's more about let's protect the human habitat. So to conclude, the main thesis in the book is that the struggle for the fight for consensus in contemporary politics revolves very much around this question about what kind of politics of protection should we should have going forward, and what kind of state and state interventionism we should pursue. So now,
Well, thank you so much. And I don't read as many books as I would like to as a journalist, and this is a very nice excuse to do it. And as someone who wrote a book and got a book contract in 2018 and was then forced to graft a pandemic onto an existing book idea, you did it much better than I managed to. So huge congratulations for that, and for this book, which is really just such an achievement. And I think maybe the first thing that I've seen, the first sort of full-length treatment to really track what has been a very strange sort of couple of years on the left, and has been, for me, I'm 30 years old, sort of the entirety of my experience on the left has been sort of post-2010, post-financial crisis. And as I was reading through the book, I was thinking through this moment in February of 2020, right before the pandemic struck, and I decided to have my birthday party the night of the Nevada primary. And so there was this moment, I was surrounded by all my friends, and we thought we were going to have a socialist president. Like, that was where we were, right? Bernie had just won by this huge majority, elected, comprised of this really exciting multiracial coalition of, really working class people who had, in the case of Nevada, sort of gone against the orders of their union and showed up really en masse for Bernie Sanders, for a democratic socialist. And that really seemed to be the culmination of these moments that you describe so well in the book, right? And I'm 30, like I said, and the sort of generation of people that I grew up with and had sort of talked about politics with, and were in some level of either sort of formal politics or NGO, nonprofit spaces, or wherever they would be, had come of age in this very particular kind of generational cohort, right? So I got to college in 2010. Occupy Wall Street happens my sophomore year. And by the time we graduate, are sort of interested in the left and, are nerds, Podemos is really taking off. You have, formations like Corbyn just sort of starting to get going right after we're out of college, or sort of starting to think about what living a life in left politics looks like. There's all of these sort of points of excitement that you can really point to, and had multiple friends go on vacation and visit, the Podemos headquarters in Madrid, and try to talk to like Pablo, or Google translating articles by Inigo, and really felt of a very particular moment, and then took lessons from those struggles, or reading people like Chantal Mouffe, Ernesto Laclau, really trying to absorb these lessons, which themselves, right, came from Argentina in the case of the sort of Podemos zeitgeist, and tried to integrate them into US politics, using the language of floating signifiers, using the sort of language of populism that had picked up in Europe, and created things like the Justice Democrats, who were influential in electing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, the first time really open democratic socialist, accountable in some capacity to a left movement into Congress, right, in 2018. And then Bernie Sanders, right, comes along before that in 2016, really sort of introduces this idea to people in the US and on the US left, which I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say had been somewhat allergic to the state, had really treated, engaging with electoral politics in some sense as kind of selling out, of, not being the sort of proper way to be a leftist. But through sort of that period, through this period that you lay out, start to reconsider in the US a sort of division that existed since, the 60s or the 70s, since 68 probably, of this harsh division between movement politics and electoral politics, and figuring out, what does it look like to really take state power? What does it look like to take control of the state in our own ways, and what that looks like? And Bernie, is one moment of that. Then we get, the elections of democratic socialist representatives, calling themselves that. And then in 2020, Bernie Sanders gets, seemingly closer than he had been in 2016. This really seemed like the moment. And within 2 weeks, that was over, right? Within 2 weeks, Bernie was out of the primary. The Democratic establishment had consolidated behind Joe Biden, and we were all at home. And, it was this really sort of scary moment, but an interesting one, and all the ways that you sort of describe in the book. And I spend most of my time reporting on the climate crisis and what had sort of gone on in parallel to that process of being comfortable with state power, of sort of getting interested in elections and things like that, was, of course, the Green New Deal, right? Which is this attempt to sort of build a vision of what a sort of redistributive, of what a protectionist state, protectionary state could look like. I'll talk about protectionism in a minute, but into a climate politics, which to that point, had been fairly localized, looking at local infrastructure fights around fossil fuels, around these, either defensive fights or, in some cases, a very small scale vision of decentralized solar, of, looking at very local examples of what a sort of climate just state could look like. And so that, that Green New Deal was, again, the sort of culmination of these different tendencies coming together in a big way, and, very sort of powerful climate justice movements against things like the Keystone XL pipeline, against the Dakota Access Pipeline, led by indigenous folks who were living with that infrastructure in their backyard, and injected a climate movement that had been, let's say, just not anti-corporate to that point, with a very sort of kind of populist energy, we might call it, but definitely an anti-corporate energy that really sort of put a target onto companies as the problem with climate change, and shifting that away from this emphasis on individual solutions or on lifestyle choices or riding your bike to work or something. So that had all gone on, and when people started talking about the Green New Deal, I think unemployment was at like 3% or 3 or 4%. We were, as close to full employment as we had been in many, many years, certainly since the Great Recession. And so there was energy about that. It was sort of a time of big ideas, like a job guarantee, like universal basic income. All of those were sort of foaming to the surface. But on a Green New Deal, it was sort of hard to make the case in a country which doesn't do sort of stimulus spending very often, that we were going to spend $16 trillion to take on a climate crisis that had not sort of integrated itself deeply into the American psyche. And that context really shifted in the pandemic, right? And so you have Biden, you have, even sort of elements of the Trump administration talking, as you said, about a more activist state, right? Picking up demands of the state to protect people, not just what we're used to having the state do in the United States, which is locking people up and criminalizing people, which is, how our state really functions and has grown through the sort of era of neoliberalism. And so we, just are in that strange moment of the time, and it's been strange to see how that moment has sort of reconciled itself in the time since then, in the time since May 2020, when everything seemed possible. I remember just reading everybody like firing off various takes about how neoliberalism is over, how we're really sort of in this new era of political economy. And I won't speak for too much longer, but it's been sort of fascinating to watch the Biden administration in particular, which after he won the Democratic primary really did, make an attempt to satisfy parts of the left, which had been a part of the Sanders coalition, bringing climate activists, for instance, onto these joint task forces, sort of shaping the agenda in some ways. And then, he goes on to propose a more sort of ambitious and big spending package, more progressive spending package than I think anyone probably would have expected of Joe Biden, a politician who has spent sort of his life, hewing a very neoliberal line, backing the crime bill in '94, all of the litany of sort of bad things Democrats have done for the last 30 years. And myself on the left, we were very surprised by that. I know like folks abroad were sort of looking at Biden and really, in really optimistic terms. That is not where we are now, of course. We did not pass a sort of hugely ambitious spending package. We don't have, $500 billion of clean energy tax credits, which is now like the most we can hope for from the remnants of Build Back Better. That program has been sort of defeated in a way, and is now up to Joe Manchin. And just two things before we close. I think in the wake of that defeat, what we've seen from the White House, informed obviously by what's happening now in Europe and the war in Ukraine, I think is this real retreat into a certain type of right-wing protectionism, into this real attempt to reshore and frame it in kind of national terms, right? And frame it as a project of national defense. We're going to reshore supply chains, make ourselves self-sufficient, make sure that the United States has everything we need at the same time as reasserting ourselves as a world power, right? To show that we can be the clean energy leaders of the future and beat China, when it comes to EVs or rare earth metals or whatever it happens to be, whatever industry of tomorrow we happen to be defining of that day. And what's strange, I think, especially, I was thinking about this reading through the book, is that there is this sort of impulse to do that sort of protective thing, which is new for this kind of Democrat, right? Which had this embrace of free trade for so long. But the sort of implements of control aren't there. Like they don't know how to use the state, right? Like they're so sort of cowed by 30, 40 years of kind of neoliberal rot, really winnowing these parts of the state which would do that, right? Which would sort of build out a domestic supply chain for EVs, right? Which would back the creation of a really green, sort of powerful military Keynesianism style state, which seems to be kind of what the administration is pushing for. And they just don't seem to know how to do it, right? They will say, we'll give some tax credits, we'll create a fund in the Department of Defense that can help with feasibility studies for lithium and things like that. But there's just not this like really robust implementation force in the state, even if there's a sort of like desire to do that rhetorically, even if there's sort of using the language of protectionism. So maybe, just, not to end on too big of a bummer note, I think, one question I'm just left with after reading the book is like, do those mechanisms of control exist? Like, is it possible at this point, given the sort of harsh time constraints that the climate crisis has put us on, needing to peak emissions by 2025, having global emissions by 2030, are the institutional constraints just too big? Has the sort of neoliberal project, as Quinn Slobodian has said, to inoculate capitalism from the threat of democracy, has that been too successful almost, right? Are these sort of both national institutions, in the US that was a separate process, the Supreme Court, the Senate are their own problems, but internationally, if you look at things like the Energy Charter Treaty, which protects energy investments from anyone who might want to shut them down and gives recourse to these corporations to come and sue sovereign governments, what is the project of eroding those sort of real state powers that have been built up through the neoliberal era? And from a strategic perspective, what does it look like to build that sort of pangolin politics that you talk about, which I loved, just such an adorable creature. And I don't think the US left has figured that out. I think the sort of embrace of the sort of internationalism that climate demands, I don't think has fully made it into the kind of left social democratic squad politics. that has been moderately successful over the last few years. And I think that's a real challenge just in terms of how we navigate this moment and, think about, at least for the next 2 years, a White House and administration which is, more open to certain things that are friendly to the left than they might have been a couple of years ago. So, yeah, that's it.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to be a little less bleak and talk a little bit about strategy as well towards the end. Let me begin by saying, for those who haven't read it, this is a great book. It's an important book. I think it really gives a framework to try to understand contemporary politics in an innovative way, really an innovative way. And I think the most important contribution is this concept of neostatism, which he opposes to neoliberalism. There's the return of the state. More and more the state, which we thought was in the way of politics and had to get rid of it, is now the way of politics, whether on the left or on the right. I think that's true. It's true since the 2008 crisis. It's been true in the way we dealt with the pandemic. Now we have war, so imagine how much states matter. I think that's the return of the state is something that we need to think, and your book gives us powerful tools to think that, I think not just in terms of description, but also in terms of a certain normative approach. Politically, I think there's something that you're saying which is important for the left, which is there is a current of the left which had historically been skeptical of the state, anti-authoritarian. We don't want power. Power is dirty. And you forcefully say, no, we want power. It's in that spirit that you were talking about. Power is important. It's hard to get, but when you get it, you can do stuff. I don't know if I can say shit, but you can do stuff. So I agree with that. I'm fully on board with this idea that it's important for the left to take power. What I'm going to talk about here, the questions I want to ask, also a little bit to stoke a bit of controversy, is the parts of the book where I am less persuaded, and in the form of questions for having a discussion. And I guess the question would revolve around the way in which you talk about the relationship between this neostatism and what you call neoliberalism, or I would say even liberalism tout court, liberal centrism. You seem to posit some kind of zero-sum relationship, that the rise of neostatism corresponds with the decline of neoliberalism, that liberalism is over, and now the real political struggle, you say, is between proprietarian populism, the far right, and democratic socialism, the far left. And that's a very 2020 kind of idea. Prior to November or whatever. Is neoliberalism really over? Is it dying? This is the idea that liberalism is about to die is an idea that the left has often fantasized about, and that the real struggle is finally happening. Finally, we can get to fight the fascists. For all the reasons that Kate said, I'm not persuaded as a description that this is what actually is happening. I think neoliberalism is alive and well, for good or for ill. We see this in the electoral results. We see Biden didn't defeat Sanders. In our country, in Italy, we don't see a struggle between the far left and the far right. We have only liberal centrism. In France, it's true that Mélenchon and Le Pen are rising, but the man to beat remains Macron. So neoliberalism is doing very well. Thank you. So I'm not convinced that the relationship between neoliberalism and neostatism is a zero-sum, as you say. In fact, in the review for the Forum on Verso that we participated in, Anton Jäger makes an important point, which is that this new state uses markets. If you think about how we solve the crisis, or how the state addressed the crisis, is bailing out banks. How we address the pandemic is the state finances private manufacturers of vaccines. So the state and the market are not in a zero-sum relationship descriptively. Neoliberalism and neostatism can coexist together. That would seem to me to be, at the level of description, something to think about, how the interaction and the articulation between this very important concept you introduce, which doesn't replace, in my opinion, neoliberalism. But what I want to talk about and pose as a, I guess, more controversial topic for discussion is at the normative level. Can we afford to ditch neoliberalism or liberalism tout court as the left, at the level of strategy? I think that at the end of, in the review I wrote of your book, I said, like, you're reckoning without the host. We need liberals, Bidens of the world, if we want to get anything done. And you responded with a line that struck me, which was, liberals are not your friends. You said, liberals are not your friends, they are actually part of the enemy. And that struck me, and I wanted to think about it with you today. If liberals are not our friends on the left, what would an aliberal or illiberal left look like? Do we want it? Is this actually something we desire, to actually posit liberalism as an enemy or not? And I'm going to try to argue that maybe we don't want to get rid of the liberals. That liberalism contains some important normative resources for the left, and that the left without liberalism, an illiberal or illiberal left, may not be as desirable as you make it out to be in your defense of what you call a socialism that protects. And to make this case, I'm going to think about three concepts that are liberal concepts that for me remain really important for thinking about what a strategy for the left to pick up the pieces from the rut that we're in now, briefly. And this will refer to some of the things that I think were not as well developed in the book. I say this having emphasized that the book is essential reading for everyone here. I teach the book. Mandatory. Illiberally. So one thing that struck me, freedom. Freedom, the concept of freedom is very little discussed in the book. And you have these three values of socialism that text: sovereignty, protection, and control. And as somebody who thinks of himself as some kind of liberal socialist or whatever, the fact of thinking about the left without freedom I wasn't comfortable with that. And you do talk about freedom. Mostly when you talk about freedom, it's about the free market or you kind of are willing to give freedom away to the enemies. Sometimes you talk about a Republican idea of freedom as an alternative to that. But I mean, freedom is just not central to your project. It's sovereignty, protection, and control. That's the socialism that protects. It's a far cry from freedom, equality, and fraternity, which is what I take the values of the French Revolution and the left tradition to stem from. So I understand where you're coming from. You want to criticize this anti-authoritarian left that doesn't want to take power. But what is the opposite of anti-authoritarianism? Is that an authoritarian left? I'm not. So I want you to talk more about freedom. First point. And I take that you can't talk about freedom without talking about liberalism. Second concept, liberal concept, pluralism. Pluralism, I checked today, is never mentioned in the book except once in a book by Galston that talks about the crisis of pluralism. And what I mean by pluralism is what Galston means, which is the idea that diversity is not just a fact, but a value, that we positively value diversity. This never comes up in the book. This never comes up in the book, and you say, when it does come up, struggles for individual rights, for pluralism, for gender or racial justice, they're always treated in a way as like a sideshow, or at worst, a distraction from the real political issue, which is distribution of material resources. And this is an old leftist trope that doesn't matter, those pluralism, cultural, religious, racial differences, class or material differences are what matter. Again, I am uncomfortable with that, especially for a book that wants to capture the spirit of the times. I think it's difficult not to think of a left project without some kind of pluralism being part of it. I think class is important, but I would try to think about some kind of co-constitutive relationship with gender, with racial struggles, which are not talked about in the strategy for a future left, which is about protection, control, and sovereignty. So freedom, pluralism. I end with a third concept, which for me is also very important and kind of liberal, as a part of thinking a future strategy for the left, progress. Progress understood, I guess, if we want to talk about it in Marxian terms, as some kind of orientation towards an ideal of full human emancipation, like Marx says, full human emancipation, which we can get at through revolution, for a sudden change, or as a regulative ideal through a series of reforms. But it seems to me an essential idea of the left that there is another world is possible, as we used to say, and that a world of full human emancipation is something that we're working towards. Again, what it seems that the left should do in the book is often manage fear, control danger, protect us from fear. So it's this kind of Hobbesian idea of where the state comes in to protect us from each other and from dangers. But there's no sense of an alternative ideal to fight for. I think if we want to start to pick up the pieces of where we went wrong, ditching freedom, ditching pluralism, and ditching progress seem to me three things we might want to avoid next time around, so that we can actually start winning, which I agree with you is what we got to do. Thank you.
All right, so thanks very much for Carlo and Kate. So I don't know if since I'm a bit authoritarian here because I'm chairing myself and chairing the meeting. So I'm confirming your hypothesis. And so let me see how much time we have. So yes, we have another kind of half an hour to discuss. So perhaps I should respond quickly to your points, and then perhaps we can open the Q&A. I'm not that authoritarian not to have a Q&A, I promise that. So perhaps, yeah, starting with Kate's points, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting also to see like, you know, that it was a kind of shared thing, this kind of Laclau and the move moment. Like many people were reflecting about these things, about kind of populism as being the new thing. And indeed, I kind of like, yeah, share with you the sense of, in a way, that the 2020 was, in a way, the peak of the moment where you get the sense that indeed the confrontation was between kind of left populists and right-wing populists, and that there was a lot of hope behind Bernie Sanders. And yeah, one sense also I got is that it was something that people were not expecting at all, that could happen, like because Bernie Sanders was the most left-wing senator, basically congressman of all, right? Was a completely marginal figure. Like now he is the head of the finance committee, right? Yeah, the budget committee, which is a very like important committee, and to think that someone like him could be in that position was unthinkable. Before that, same thing with Corbyn. And one sense I get is that many left activists got so dispirited after the defeat, say, of the Corbyn project and of the Sanders project, often in a way that is not really rational, in a sense that because it's a bit like, you know, you got a lottery ticket, you got shortlisted for 20 million prize, and then eventually you didn't get the 20 million prize, but still, right, you got shortlisted, right? And that it really speaks a bit also to kind of certain psyche that is, I think, quite problematic on the left, in a sense of blitz mentality, or like, you know, like we need to do things now, though, right, that doesn't really augur well for organization that by its very nature is more about really kind of being long-term and being premised on being prepared for defeat and kind of balancing the highs and downs of political activity, which by its nature are always there. But we're very much in a kind of charismatic and emotional politics where that is very difficult to handle, right? In a sense, people get very easily enthused, but then equally they get very, very depressed. And perhaps that is also a problem with kind of climate change and climate politics, because on the one hand, you have this sense of urgency that we need to do things now, that the thing is so alarming that indeed we have kind of like 7 years or 8 years. But also in a way I remember climate discourse has always been about that. Like what I mean, in 2007, I was involved in a climate camp in Britain. It was already back then, it was like, we just have 8 years to go. And there's always a bit of, I'm never quite sure how much that is mobilizing or demobilizing, right? The kind of framework, in a sense that on the one hand, yes, it tells people you need to do things now, because actually every more year that elapses, basically the kind of room for incisive action is shrinking. Yeah. But on the other hand, I think one big opportunity of climate change is that it forces, in a way, politics to start thinking again like long-term. Right? In decades, even in centuries, because one of the curious things about climate effects is that, I mean, for example, rising sea levels, the consequences for rising sea levels of what we have done in the last decades is going to go on for centuries, actually. It's such a slow motion. Certain things about climate change are so slow motion. And so there is an opportunity there. I mean, in terms of protectionism, it's true that there is a risk that it's going towards a kind of more nationalist project, and some of the very language used there, kind of buy American, right, is framed as national competition, which is now worrying as we are seeing that things in the world are increasingly going into a kind of frame of superpower confrontation, right? Basically China and the US, with the option of this called Thucydides trap. I don't know if you ever heard about this expression, which is basically the situation. It referred to the kind of conflict between Sparta and Athens in ancient Greece. Thucydides trap is when a fading hegemon, faced with the rise of a new hegemon, triggers war against this rising hegemon, right? So the kind of nightmare scenario basically is that at some point with China rising and rising, the US will enter a war with China or a proxy war. I mean, that's one interpretation of what is going on in Ukraine, right? As a sort of the first proxy war of this superpower confrontation. On the other hand, though, I think that we need to, I mean, some forms of protectionism, some moderate forms of protectionism are understandable and perhaps are actually positive for internationalism in some weird form. In a sense that I think it is always, how would you say, a balance between autonomy and interdependence. So for a long time, we thought that economic interdependence is good for peace. There was a selling point, actually, of globalization, right? Basically, if we trade with one another, it's not only good, it's good, A, because we get cheap products. And that was the greatest selling point of globalization. Yes, your wages may go down, your working situations may get worse, but still, you can get your plasma screen for 1/3 of the price you would have gotten otherwise. Right? But another selling point was that, hey, if we are trading, China and the US, Europe and China, basically, we will minimize the prospects for war because there are vested interests, material interests, that are militating against that, because there are investments of companies in other countries. Yep. That is, I think, true to a certain extent. But there is also a thing called the jealousy of trade. Namely that sometimes interconnection, interdependence, reliance on other countries and other countries' resources can actually have the opposite effect and be more a trigger for war. So you are now seeing that, for example, in the case of Ukraine and Europe. So the extreme dependence that Europe has on Russia for energy is being used by Russia as a means to blackmail. In turn, the extreme dependence that Russia, as any country in the world, has on the Western financial system is being weaponized as a means, right, of political pressure, right, by through sanctions, by excluding basically Russia from the financial system. So, and another factor in the equation is that the level of interconnectedness that we have reached at the point of high globalization, though this is not the first globalization in history, it is unprecedented in volume and intensity, right? And the famous example being the iPhone, right, where materials come from 3-4 countries, some components are assembled in 4 or 5 countries, it is packaged in one country, it is designed in another country, it is... so I think that some degree of protection of production is actually potentially beneficial and can balance out some of these extreme interconnectedness. Because, I mean, for example, if you look at tariffs have always been there through history, but now they are record low. They've never been this low. And the point about tariffs was not blocking trade. Otherwise, you could just kind of stop the goods coming in. It was inserting some frictions in the trade system whereby you would stop commercial practices that you considered nefarious for your own country. For example, social dumping or environmental dumping. Yep. So I think the point of considering that barriers are not necessarily nefarious, but that they are more an element of friction, I think is useful. I would say something that is coming back, and it's coming back anyway for some reasons. Then you can have, instead of tariffs, you can have subsidies, for example, if you want to maintain a strategic sector of your economy, semiconductors, EVs, and so on and so forth. And so this was the first point. In a way, I don't feel that protectionism as such is bad. In a way, the US was founded on protectionism. Like the Hamiltonian spirit was about, if the US wants to be a country rather than an appendage of the United Kingdom, it needs to protect its own economy, right? In a way, the famous Hamiltonian moment was about that. So I think in a way, it's not a matter of kind, it's a matter of degrees, right there. And the other point on I completely agree with you on, and in a way, also a point that Carlo was making, that yes, we see a lot of state intervention, a lot of state spending, but this is being directed to the market. It's basically just a state that is a credit card state, in a way, right? It's a credit card state, so kids take the credit card and go buy what you want, but with no intervention of the state deciding or even, let alone producing things, which is, for example, not what happened in the times of Roosevelt and the New Deal, which was very much about creating entities, authorities, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, and many others authorities, right? So it was a constructionist moment. It was a moment where you establish new authorities of the state that are not only spending, but they are organizing the world, organizing society, right? They are engaging in huge, massive projects. So I think, like, there's a lot of talk about abolitionism as a position on the left for abolishing elements of the state that are considered nefarious or negative, right? And in some cases, indeed, if there are institutions that are not working, you may want to abolish them. But I think you also need, perhaps, to accompany that with elements of foundationalism, that you need to found also new authorities. You need a kind of new modernist spirit of, if we want to shape the world, we need to create and construct the structures to do that, right? We need to create new state authorities that are fit for purpose. For example, for climate change, you could create so many of them, and the more authorities, the better, really. Which neoliberals wouldn't agree with. And so, and now moving to Carlo's point, I mean, in a way, indeed, kind of like some of my argument is kind of forceful, sometimes is a bit also polemical. So there is the spirit of that. I mean, when I say that liberals are not your friends, I'm not saying that liberals are your enemies. So there is a difference there. And also, I mean, indeed, there is a very big difference in what liberal means in the US and it means in Europe, right? In a sense, in Europe, it means centrist, free market centrist. Also, I think that neoliberalism and liberalism is not the same thing. Neoliberalism is a breed of liberalism, and it's quite an extreme breed of liberalism. In a sense, the people like Adam Smith were more statist than neoliberals, especially US neoliberals, are. Not to speak of libertarians, which are the kindergarten version of neoliberalism, right? It's basically neoliberalism for kids, which is, interestingly, the breed that is now growing a lot subculturally, which to me speaks precisely to neoliberalism crisis. And indeed, I mean, is not, I mean, in the book, if anything, I already covered too much ground. So it's not that I not talking about freedom, equality, and fraternity. I'm in a way dispatching them, or like I'm not considering them important. The point is precisely what you're saying, that in a way the kind of the spirit of the book is going against a certain unconscious anti-authoritarianism that has been prevalent on the left, partly because of its marginalization, right? As a sort of rationalization of, hey, I'm not able to get power, so power is bad. Like a bit like whatever, a kid that is not given chocolate, so starts thinking, oh, chocolate is not good. It doesn't taste good because I cannot get it. And obviously, I'm not saying that that this is completely rational. I mean, partly it is a rationalization of not being able to get power. Partly it is because of totalitarianism. It is because of bureaucratism. It is because of bad leaderism. It is because of, right? I'm not denying that there are kind of some good reasons for that. Yet at the same time, in a way, my urge is that we need to take power seriously, and we need to take power. And one book I strongly disagreed with was John Holloway's famous book, kind of Change the World Without Taking Power, which encapsulated the spirit of the anti-globalization movement. And to me, it was exactly the very wrong way to go about this question of power. So basically, it was a book that recommended people to avoid structures, bureaucracies, and institutions. Instead, you need to change the world through social movements and stuff. While I think that now the real, in a way, to me, the really enthusing thing of the left in the 2010s was precisely this return of sense of possibility. Hey, actually, we can take power, we can take institutions, we can change them, right? We have the power to do that. And I mean, the same goes for pluralism and stuff. I mean, in a way, is, you know, actually there are some currents now, ideological currents like neo-authoritarianism, for example, in China, in particular the Xi Jinping intellectual framework is partly inspired by that. And there is kind of like the traditionalism by Dugin in Russia that has inspired the Putin. And these are kind of very kind of radical reactions against liberalism and against the failings of neoliberalism and liberalism, which actually have earned some sympathy on the left, the so-called red-brown. I mean, to me, that was always, I always strongly suspected that. I saw that subculturally some people on the left were actually espousing that, but it is completely the wrong response, because is nihilism. It has a nihilist element to that, right? In the sense that you say, okay, and I also see that in whatever, some sympathy in very, very super marginal sectors of the left, for example, for Putin, but it's almost like this sentiment of liberalism is so wrong, Western society is so wrong, that I'll sympathize for anything that is against it, right? But it's like, it's exactly the definition of nihilism. It doesn't have any hope or kind of ambition or project of changing things. Basically, you hate your society and ultimately yourselves. It's basically almost an act of suicide, or kind of symbolic suicide. You just want to punish society. You don't want to change society. So yeah, I mean, I hope that with these remarks, I kind of like address your points, and now perhaps we can open up to questions.
Hello, thank you for a very stimulating panel so far. So this is more of a speculative question, in part because I haven't read the book so far, though of course now we all will. But I'm thinking about and this is probably something you speak to in the book, but I'm thinking about what the connection is between the neoliberal dominance that we had, say, 10, 20 years ago, and this neo-statist tendency that we're observing at the moment. And when I speculate in that question myself, what I sort of immediately think that it has to do with, well, during neoliberalism, human relations were eroded. So our labor unions got weaker, our political parties got weaker, families got weaker. We even lost ability to identify that we're deeply in need of close human relations. And it seems then that to explain the neo-statist tendency, it would be some sort of desperate scream for protection somewhere, because we don't have these more horizontal human relations have been eroded, so we're going for the best and sort of most immediate we can, which is this. It's sort of like a drive for some sort of paternalism to come and help us out. And I think that's a scary idea. That I think it's scary that it might suggest that we don't have the impulse of trying to build back the kind of relations we used to have. Instead, we have this false safety, or at least at least a safety that is only as secure as who is in power at any given moment, and with the kind of leaders at the global stage at the moment, we have good reasons to fear who might inhabit the state apparatus at any given moment. And then it seems, then I get a bit, I think I second a lot of, I think, Professors Invernizzi-Accetti's fears that we are not building back what we need to both fight for something bigger and a human flourishing that goes beyond being protected by the state, but also that we will be very easily exploited. And we might, since we have this false security of the state looking after us, we might not realize that what we desperately need to do is to build stronger communities, and like several levels of backup when the state fails us, which the state repeatedly does, and we see that many places globally. So I'd like to hear what you see as the connection between neoliberalism and neo-statism, and why have we gone from one to the other, and maybe have you, or especially you, Professor Gerbaudo, speak to this. What do you think that fear is a relevant one, and that the state might stand a bit in the way of us identifying that we need desperately to build back communities, I think, more than anything else.
I have a provocation. We've engaged in these conversations before, but my provocation is, I think this discussion of neo-statism versus neoliberalism is correct in some respects, but I think we also in an analytic trap, in that we might be transitioning out of what we know into something we don't have the correct tools of analysis. And part of what has been an issue with, I think, part of the left, especially the anti-globalization left, is that the sort of obsessive myopic focus on neoliberalism rather than the question of capitalism obscures the fact that this is one regime of capitalism that can go into another regime, and there has been other regimes before. And part of what we see, particularly when we look outside of into the sort of peripheries, to use that expression, is that we're seeing sort of like almost a mercantile return to, I would describe as closer to 17th century Europe than anything else, and where you have sort of like various degrees of private violence, protecting access to resources without having a political project, without offering anything. So when you have that, you also have something which is neither neoliberalism or neostatism. It's kind of like basically capitalist Hobbesianism. It's effectively a war against all private power because there is no longer a collective subject or hope for a future. And then part of what I think your work spoke to is like the hyper-politicization of everything has made us turn inwards and look at ourselves. And part of the reason on the left has been position, and I think this is why your book is important, is that we're grappling right now with the inability, because history has returned, of our analytic tools to comprehend some of these transformations, not just in capitalism, but in the state form itself. And I think that's something that we like really staring in the face. And I mean, I would also suggest that one of the reasons for this is the struggle is that our knowledge economy has been so tied to the academy, and simply put, new ideas and thinking through things are not going to be rewarded in terms of grants and such.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this interesting panel. And I'm sorry if my question is addressed in the book. Haven't read it yet, but now that there's a mandate, it's going to happen. So I wanted just to have your take on populism in power. So you addressed it by saying how much populism is anti-elitist in many forms. And so there is a form of paradox in actually getting into power and then becoming the elite in a certain sense. And what I was thinking about is, because you make a very clear link between left populism and right populism on this idea of protection, which I never thought about and I find very interesting. But for some reason, right populism managed to get to power pretty well, especially in Europe right now, but also here, of course, while left populism do not. And either they corrupt the social movement of the beginning once getting into power. So Podemos and Ciudadanos are not the same thing, and then ended up losing, or they don't get to power at all. And a lot of this, and I was thinking about the Italian example, right? That is a recent example of populism in power, where two different populist movements that had, in principle, nothing to do with each other went to government together, didn't last, because basically one ate the other. And that's because right-wing populism has very clear ideas and managed to impose them to more anti-politics movements. And so I don't have a clear question. I just wanted to know your take about this. And also because you mentioned, I'm based in France, and you mentioned one interesting social movement in France, which is the Gilets jaunes, but there's another one, which is Nuit debout. Interestingly, none of those went anywhere in terms of power. Gilets jaunes went nowhere. There is no party that comes out of that movement. And it's probably because it's an anti-everything movement. They never ended up proposing anything. So there's a lot of what we don't want, and basically they don't want, of course, the green tax, but then they also don't want gay rights for some reason, even though it has nothing to do with anything. But Nuit debout, on the other hand, was really one of those movements that doesn't want power because it would lose its essence, but then it faded and got nowhere as well. So yes, that's what I was wondering, what this paradox of anti-politics for populist movement is really different between left populism and right-wing populism, and if so, what's the essence of this difference and how can it be overcome? Because in the end, populism has a bad name right now because only extreme right populism go to power with terrible results. Thanks.
All right. So yes, I mean, yeah, I thought your question on neoliberalism and neostatism is really interesting. Indeed, I mean, in a way, that's a very good explanation of what has been happening. because indeed, as say, primary or organic, should we say, social relationships is based on kind of family, class, and social representation. Indeed, have been eroding throughout the 40 years, say, of neoliberalism. And indeed, one could read neo-statism as a sort of compensation response. So in a situation in which you cannot rely anymore on social organization, social representation, in a way you offload all that necessity onto politics directly. That is partly also what happens with populism, right? The processes that before were happening on kind of two different tiers, two different layers, first social representation, then going into political representation. For example, trade unions, then represented by left parties. It is as if they need to kind of immediately jump to the political level, which is in a way kind of overcharged with all these need to represent people that enter politics not as part of groups, but as individuals, right? So there is a sort of direct connection between the individual and the political, which is what leads also to the very emotional character of a lot of politics these days, right? But then also leads to a number of problems. I'm also hearing, I'm hearing that from many people, and this sense so that now politics is something individual and personal that affects you directly. And indeed, that can carry risks, so that there is also how certain authoritarian movements in a way came to the fore, precisely representing individuals that felt abandoned, that felt disgruntled, that gave them a sense of purpose. But that's also in general how democracy works, in a sense that partly also kind of modern democracies were a response to atomization and individualization, making people feel part of a community, right? And I don't think there is, in a way, necessarily, obviously, a contradiction between state intervention and social organization. I also think that we need strong communities. Obviously, I have no objection against that. But perhaps state interventionism and using the levers of the state can be a tool for that. So actually, in the US, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the highest level of unionization was actually achieved as state interventionism was reaching its peak, right? Because it provided an opportunity to leverage. It provided also kind of a call for mobilization, in a sense that it was the famous, like, whatever quote, like by Roosevelt, now that I'm in power, you need to mobilize, so you will force me to do the things that you need me to do, right? At that point, there is a sort of clear stake for popular movements to mobilize, because you mobilize in order that the people in power get the goods for you. So do you see what I mean? In a sense that I don't think that the two things are necessarily in contradiction. And I think that, in a way, betting on state intervention provides very clear focal point that then popular movements can use as a pressure point. And also, I mean, one example is the Protect Act, which interestingly, like, right, it uses language of protection, protect the right of workers to organize, right? So it's actually a state legislation that is though meant to make it easier. I don't know where it is, languishing somewhere in Congress, like not going to be approved, but still, right? But what it's meant to do is to make social organization easier, right? By changing the laws that are presiding over that. And now turning, so I hope kind of I cover your question, but I think this is really interesting, and I kind of very much share that kind of reading of the situation. And indeed, with Ben's question, yes, I mean, it's two different, in a way, some of the kind of criticism I got on my book from people on the left, mostly I think stems from this confusion. And when you say neoliberalism is over, some people take as capitalism is over, right? And we got to the point where people confuse the two things. And neoliberalism was actually always a more kind of intellectually sounding alternative to capitalism. Like, so to me, in a way, the point is that the theoretical usefulness of the term as expired. It captured very well certain things about the conjuncture, because with one term you could say everything. It is an ideology, it is a project, it is a brand of neoliberalism. It really captured zeitgeist, right? But to me, it doesn't do it anymore, partly because of, by dint of repetition, sometimes the idea wear out, and that is to me the case with neoliberalism. And indeed, I mean, part of that is, as you say, mercantilism, right? In a sense that it's something that speaks to what Germany has been doing with foreign trade, for example. It is idea of, it's not an idea of retreating from the world market, but it is an idea of, this is my market, and you don't touch it, and I also want your market, by the way. Right? It's a kind of idea of captive markets. It's, in a way, imperialism, right? It makes some idea by Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg actually quite relevant once again. Like, it's different imperialist powers that are saying, hey, this is my supply chain, don't touch it, this is my market, right? Solomon Islands belong to me, as Australia is saying to China. China is saying, no, the Solomon Islands actually in my sphere of influence. But it's interesting because it's revealing what in a way was always there. That the free market was always a fiction. It was always the case. It is more of almost an epistemic phenomenon. It's now becoming very clear what in a way was always there. And there, the final question on populism and power. Indeed, yeah, especially in Latin America, it was mostly kind of, it is left populism that won, and now we have the example of Chile. In Colombia, even they won. It's more social democratic in a way in Colombia, but we have some very good examples of kind of left populism in power with varying results, right? There's always some contradiction there, as I guess for any political force when they're faced with the question of power. But yeah, the anti-politics element, I think, was obviously for social movements. Social movements don't need to take power in the sense that they can just be a kind of means of contestation. But it was interesting that many of these new movements, like from Occupy and Indignados to Gilets jaunes, combine these two very contradictory things. On the one hand, we hate politics, or we hate our representatives because they're not representing us. At the same time, they also had a sort of statist element. Occupy Wall Street was saying, we want just government, which to me didn't sound really anarchist. The Gilets jaunes wanted to introduce the RIC, Referendum d'Initiative Citoyenne, so like citizen referendum. So they were always also asking questions about the state and how to change democracy. Yeah. So I don't know if, so I don't think that in a way left populism in power is necessarily always leading to failure. In the case of the five-star movement, for example, it actually, which is not really left either, but actually they achieved some of the biggest policy achievements in Italy over the last decades. They introduced a new social welfare provision that caters for poor people. And it's something that has really profoundly changed the way in which people live. If I'm thinking of real left populism, like Podemos in Spain, has also introduced many measures that are really changing the life of people for the better. The curious thing, though, is that often this doesn't necessarily reap results in terms of consensus. There is a problem, right? In the sense that, I'm seeing that with Podemos. Actually, Podemos achieved so much, and then you would expect people being very happy, and they getting more consensus, but that is not sometimes necessarily the case. So which remains a bit of an enigma.
So I'm gonna yield my time for the questions, but telegraphically, I thought your point was really interesting about how left and right populism are different when they're in power. Right populism seems quite successful, and left populism fails a lot. I think it's not a coincidence. I think it's not a coincidence because it's the argument I've been trying to make. I think left populism is a contradiction in terms. I agree with Nikki Vendel. I said, il populismo è una semina destra. Populism is sowing seeds with your right hand. So it's good as a method of coming to power, but once you're in power, you can't reconcile this kind of leaderism, this kind of substantivized idea of the people with a left-wing project. It's authoritarian populism, and therefore it's not on the left. And so when it comes to power, it crumbles. So I think it's not a coincidence that right-wing populism is coherent and left-wing populism is a contradiction in terms.
I'll say briefly so we can get more questions. I mean, the thing, I brought up this briefly, but I think governing is really important, which got a little bit lost, at least in the US side, in terms of, you know, we can get people elected, we'll get people to power, but really just the sort of institutions which would have created a sort of class of functional bureaucrats to run a left state just does not exist. And I can't speak to other context really, but in the US, I think that's been a massive problem. There just are not the sort of people that existed in the New Deal to found new institutions and to, you know, build out a kind of leftist state. And so we've ceded those powers, essentially, which I think speaks to a lot of what has been said already.
If we can get the last few questions.
Sorry, I just wanted to acknowledge the important subtext of the book, which you've alluded to tonight, but the core periphery dynamic, both within countries and in terms of kind of building a new like left internationalism. And I think that, you know, this is kind of building off of my review of the book for the BAPLA, but you know, that if you don't approach power, you can't even begin to imagine, you know, truly like something that transcends national borders in terms of real solidarity. And unfortunately, you know, you can say social democratic politics is sort of bankrupt, that it's just, you know, capitalism with a human face, but multiracial social democracy has not yet really been tried. So it's worth trying for that. It's worth aiming for that. And, you know, just on the subject of the New Deal, you know, one of the big twists that we kind of forget is that the Democratic Party was the party of the periphery. And now we have this, you know, it's not the same, it's not an exact reversal, but now the Democratic Party is a party of the economic core in many respects, not entirely, but in very important respects. And so what happened in the 30s is clearly a migration of industrial workers in the North and middle class or formerly middle class voters to the Democratic Party, which was essential to, you know, the leftward tilt of New Deal liberalism. Now, of course, you know, there were Southern radicals too that were for, you know, they were not racist. They were for, you know, maybe kind of like a nebulous movement toward multiracial democracy. But you know, that was an important transformation. And I think that moving forward, as we think about this book, this, you know, the thesis of how do you create a genuinely left protectionism, you have to, it's not about concessions, right? It's not about concessions on people's rights, their identities, and it's, you know, in a negative fashion, saying that we don't care about gender or multiculturalism. On the contrary, but you have to figure out how to win, right? And of course, the Democratic Party has the majority, but the institutions don't work, right? The institutions are anti-majoritarian. So you have to figure out how to steer investment in a very productive fashion. And I think that that's where industrial policy comes in. And you can, you know, maybe emphasize it as it's an ecological goal, but it's a social goal. It's a goal that puts the, you know, the community first. And I mean, it's just, that's the nature of politics, is that you have to turn on the spigot and give people money to feel like they are doing well, but not just in the forms of stimulus checks. You have to build up the institutions. That includes labor unions, but also, like what we talked about, the authorities that were created under the New Deal. Can those bureaucracies be recreated and be more democratic? I mean, that's a major dilemma, but it's important that there's a regional dimension to it, or else you just lose it. You lose it to the right. It's very dangerous.
Hi. Hi. Thank you very much for the panel. I just wanted to know what's your take or your perspective in the Latin American countries, or if you can talk a little bit, for example, about what the so-called pink tide governments in Latin America. And I'm thinking just in a question, or that this kind of contradiction, no, that many countries or many governments face when they won the elections, and suddenly they were implementing policies against neoliberalism, and they, for example, there was a redistribution of wealth, there was a decrease in on the poverty, but at the same time they relied more in extractivism, that is a contradiction with climate change, and at the same time, during the commodity boom, they relied more on global markets. So how this more statist project came to rely more in markets and in extraction, and so
Extractivism.
So I just have well, it was a remark you made, like an offhand remark about, so I take issue with the framing of like sympathy for Putin, because I think that's for Putin, or a lot earlier when you mentioned the situation in Ukraine. I think that's a reference, like it's a frame of reference as being, or a certain framing that's being used by corporate media, by the US State Department, which makes everything about the personality of Putin and sort of his, his mental state, or whatever you want to think of it. I think in reality, when you look at it, there's a lot of sympathy, and it's for Russia, right? It's for Russia's security and its security concerns. That might not be true in the US, that might not be true in Europe, but beyond that, even the New York Times talked about how in many countries, there is a lot of sympathy for the NATO's, sort of decades-long encirclement of Russia. And I think these concerns are not being taken serious in the media, and I think we should be careful about not echoing that, because we're not going to find a solution ever to that situation if we don't address that reality. So that's just that point. And about authoritarianism and the left, I think that also has to be, it's a little tricky. I think that any real project for power, if we're going to talk about power, it's going to have to make some major changes. And I'm talking like seriously structural changes that you can't make through like setting up a new institute within the confines of what's acceptable. For example, in the US Constitution, sort of like disrupting property rights. You just can't do that. So by its nature, there is some authoritarianism, even if it's the majority taking power from the capitalist minority. And that's something Marx and Engels, addressed a long time ago against the anarchists, for example. But it's a very like essential point about power. If we're serious about power and not just like winning an election in which we end up sabotaging ourselves because we can't make the changes, and then the right, gains from that. And I think we keep seeing that, and it's repetitive. I think that's something that has to be acknowledged, because otherwise this is going to keep repeating. Yeah, those are my 2 points.
I was just wondering whether you are in a hurry, we need to close as we are past the time, or? Right, brilliant. Okay, so just, all right, brilliant. Thanks very much for your question, Justin, and for your review. Yes, how should I put it? Yeah, I think that ultimately politics is about building coalitions, right? And you need to build coalitions uniting people that are very different. And one of the ways you do that traditionally, indeed, is providing them with something they have an interest in, a vested interest in, which doesn't necessarily need to be just economic, but a project of the country, right? A country that can. That's what, in a way, Trump has done with his own followers, right? What the right does very well, which is combining moral and material interest together in a project, right? And what perhaps this is a question to you that you may answer after the event, but I mean something I'm wondering about the U.S. So what is the reason why Biden has one of the lowest approvals of any U.S. president, despite the fact that he has given a lot of money to the people, right? He has opened the spigot. I mean, much of what he wanted to do didn't go through, right? But he has done stimulus checks, he has done the Infrastructure Act, yet he's very unpopular, right? Is it because of rhetoric, because of performance, because of the fact that he doesn't manage to do a press conference without then having to correct what he said? Is it because, I mean, right? I'm really wondering, right? In a sense, is because he doesn't incarnate whatever a project. But yeah, I think the question is very much this, in a sense, how you build a project, a proposal that is not just kind of making money available, nor is just policy making, but is also an organizational project. Like, how do you set up also technocrats, bureaucrats? How do you create the personnel without which you cannot really bring to fruition projects that are so ambitious and so in breaking with what we have been used to for 40 years. Indeed, I mean, I think that the image we were using, Kate, before is very salient there in a sense. They actually perhaps want to do kind of statism, but everything they've been taught for 40 years is the only thing they can do is give incentives or subsidies. Like, they cannot reason in more organizational terms, in terms of actual constructivism of new apparatuses of the state, as they were doing back in the days. And I mean, on extractivism and Latin America, I mean, that is actually very interesting because, in a way, I think that provided a very clear pathway for state power and for redistribution on the left, because extractivist industries are very concentrated and they are monopolistic and they're often kind of state monopolies, right? So as a leftist, you can go there and say, hey guys, there is this money, like say Venezuela, there is this oil that I can control as a state, and I will use this resource to redistribute it, right? And though then often is also the limit of certain left populist projects in Latin America, as they try to then move out of dependence on that one sector. And I think actually Venezuela has been trying to do that genuinely for ages since Chavez. They really try to diversify out of that, right? And to create a more diversified economy and not to fall kind of in the kind of Dutch illness trap in this. But it is so hard structurally, like when you're in that position, right? That not even Brazil kind of has managed to kind of rid itself of this commodity dependency, right? Despite Brazil being such a large country, which with a more diversified. So, but I think it is interesting that, I mean, one of the reasons I think why left populism was so successful part in Latin America was precisely that being the commodity production so concentrated and so controlled by the state, there was a clear pathway that you could use for a distribution ultimately, right? And I mean, on the Putin question, I mean, it was just a kind of like passing comment in a sense. It was not, I wasn't making a kind of big. First and foremost, I don't think that it is very popular position on the left either. It's something that, I mean, at least in the case of Italy, and in the case of Britain, it has been kind of weaponized. Few cases of people who are kind of overtly sympathizing for Putin himself, while actually the main sympathizers of people doing business with Putin have been people like Tony Blair or Silvio Berlusconi, or right. And it's been so shameful how the press has just kind of singled out some people to say, hey, look, these are the people to blame. Then indeed, also, it's a very tricky question, definitely kind of not expansion as a part in that. But yeah, the thing you were saying about authoritarianism and of contracts, and yeah, indeed, I mean, it's something I was always thinking when I was reading kind of people like Foucault and total institutions being places like whether psychiatric hospitals or such things, and say, what about the workplace? Isn't that also a total institution? I mean, sometimes like the authoritarianism of society is far more in the face than these total institutions that sometimes are pictured in anti-authoritarian discourse.
I don't know. We passed our time, so I'll take the chair. Let's thank Paolo for his, and thank you everybody else. Thank you for being here, and I don't know.
Thanks everyone. And mandatory reading, yeah.